As security professionals, we should be familiar with security-related laws and regulations and how they can affect us as the security team. Now, this is a really complex world. Security-related laws that deal with everything from federal to state level to international levels, dealing with things like privacy. And we see this in many cases at a federal or at a state level. Many countries have had regulations on transporter data flow. If I'm going to use a cloud service provider who's going to store my data, where can they store it? Do they have to store it within my country or my region? Also, if the cloud service provider backs up the data, where is their backup site? Is it still within the same country or the same region? There's a lot of regulations on the flow of sensitive information about citizens from one country, perhaps to another country where it could be accessible by people in another jurisdiction. There are a number of laws that relate to the critical infrastructure, that which we need in order to be able to operate today. Everything from electrical power to telecommunications to water and gas supplies. All of these parts of the critical infrastructure are often affected by regulatory concerns as well, whether or not it's NERC in the energy industry or whether or not it's laws dealing with protecting critical infrastructure in my country and what's required to do that. Now, there's also an area here that's kind of interesting, and that's what we call dual use goods. A dual use good is something that can be used in both a commercial and in a military setting. And one example of this always, of course, is cryptography. Cryptography and cryptographic algorithms can very much be used by companies to protect their email and their sensitive data. But we know that cryptography has for many years been a part of military operations and protecting military secrets and communications. So many countries have had very strict regulations on the import and export of dual-use goods. And this restricts whether or not I could bring cryptographic algorithms into certain countries or export them out. The same as with other types of technology that can be used in both commercial and military settings. A number of countries got together with what we call the Wassenaar Arrangement. And the Wassenaar Arrangement was an agreement when it came to dual-use goods that said, okay, if it's already publicly available, there's no sense putting constraints on it. And there are agreements of cryptographic algorithms that can be shared between countries and between regions, usually based on the type of algorithm and the length of the key. Because very often the key length is one of the factors in determining the strength of the cryptographic algorithm itself. We also have a number of regional laws that apply within, for example, the European region, that of GDPR. And in a lot of cases, local and state laws as well. So it's a complex world. And in many cases, it's frankly impossible to comply with all the various laws in each jurisdiction if we're a multinational organization. The legal world itself is made up of a number of different types of law as well. For example, we have criminal law. Criminal law is where a person has done an offense against the state, against the country itself. It's against society. And in many cases, criminal law is what we call statutory in the fact that it is written laws and regulations that govern what a person can or cannot do. In the case of criminal law, we do have a couple of different approaches. The British Empire was often based on common law, and common law was based on things like precedents and rulings from higher courts, where other countries such as France and Germany were based more on statutory law, where everything was codified as to what was allowed or not. There's a very different way that the courts and of course investigations are handled under those two different styles. but they both have an element of what we call criminal law or laws against society itself. We also have laws that deal with the dispute between individuals. Let's say, for example, I had a contract to paint your fence, and I painted your fence. In the end, you looked at it and said, I'm not paying for this. You missed spots. You've done a really bad job. I'm not going to pay for it. That's not a criminal act, but it's a dispute between two individuals. I want to get paid, and you don't want to be paid for, let's say here, insufficient quality of work. Now, in the case of civil, or we'll call this contract, or sometimes called tort law, it comes into this area where you would put your case forward, your argument for why you shouldn't pay, and I'd put my case forward of why you should. And the dispute would be then recognized according to what we call the preponderance of evidence. So whichever ways the scales tipped, the scales of justice, in the case of where you put together a better argument why you shouldn't pay, well, then the finding would probably be in your favor. Very different than how we do things in a criminal law situation, where it's the state or the country itself prosecuting the person. For example, in the United States, you'll often see the United States versus the individual. Or in the British Empire, we'll often see it written as Regina. In other words, the Queen versus the individual who's done something against the good of society. We also have administrative law. This deals with the many different regulated industries and so on, such as even if you want to practice as a lawyer or a doctor, or if you want to run a pharmacy, you want to run a telco, you've got all sorts of laws that apply to you in that industry sector. And these are administrative types of laws. We have regulatory law that turns around and says these are certain regulations that you must abide by. And of course, a lot of international laws as well that are not just specific to one country, but deal with things like treaties and deal with, for example, maritime law, the law of the high seas. And these are international agreements that supersede the jurisdiction of any one country.